All right, so this is the third class of a 3-week course. The first class was on Marcion, the first famous heretic in church history. And then we talked about the Council of Nicaea last week, what he got right and wrong. And now this week we'll talk about post-supersessionist theology, positive developments in the church's understanding of Israel since the Holocaust. And so my goal has been to support the broad claim that while the church is imperfect and has made tragic mistakes throughout its history, we should appreciate the church for upholding the Tanakh and whole New Testament as scripture. So we talked about week 1 with Marcion, for defending the deity of Yeshua for millennia. So we talked about last week, the Council of Nicaea, and then on working on correcting replacement theology, which is what we will talk about tonight. So we'll start with definitions. Essentially a synonym for replacement theology is supersessionism. So this is from a dictionary of Jewish-Christian relations, written by Dr. Kendall Solon. I was privileged enough to have him as a professor at Emory. And so he gives this as a definition for supersessionism. He says, to the traditional Christian belief that since Christ's coming, the church has taken the place of the Jewish people as God's chosen community, and that God's covenant with the Jews is now over and done. Then also in the book, he also gives a definition for replacement theology after remarking that they are essentially synonyms. In this section, he says, replacement theology took shape during the 2nd century CE based upon a selective and embellished reading of the New Testament, and was a generally accepted staple of Christian theology from the 3rd century onward. Christian theologians found various ways to express the central idea that the church had supplanted the Jewish people and henceforth was the true Israel of God. And we'll talk more about that phrase later, Israel of God, in the presentation. And so this may sound abstract, and it's probably something many here are familiar with, this claim that the church has replaced Israel, and that's replacement theology. Christian scholar, New Testament scholar Joel Willits, I like what he says about supersessionism. He makes it a little more grounded, a little more realistic. He says supersessionism refers to any interpretation of the New Testament that intentionally or unintentionally would lead to the eventual disappearance of the Jewish ethnos, the Jewish people, from within the church of Jesus the Messiah. So this is really good. It's not just abstract. He brings it down to earth, how theology affects real people and affects real communities. And so we'll talk about that a lot, that's kind of the concept that's undergirding a lot of what's being talked about today, and that theology affects behavior, it affects communities, and vice versa. The way we behave impacts our theology, the theology we have impacts the way we behave, and the communities that we form around said theologies. And so him highlighting that supersessionism results in the disappearance of Jewish people from within the church, or the ecclesia, or the body of Messiah, however you want to call it, is a key thing to keep in mind as we discuss replacement theology. All right, so now that we understand replacement theology, or supersessionist theology, we can now better understand what is post-supersessionist theology. So Dr. Solon again, he says, post-supersessionism designates not a single viewpoint, but a loose and partly conflicting family of theological perspectives that seeks to interpret the central affirmations of Christian faith in ways that do not state or imply the abrogation or obsolescence of God's covenant with the Jewish people. In other words, in ways that are not supersessionist. Positively expressed, a theology is post-supersessionist if it affirms the present validity of God's covenant with Israel as a coherent and indispensable part of the larger body of Christian teaching. So this is important. He's not just saying that it's a theology that says Jewish people can be saved. It's not just a theology saying that there's a future for corporate Israel and they coming to be saved, but at past, present, future, the Jewish people are still in covenant with God. God did not abandon the covenant with Israel for any reason in the last thousands of years. So this is a really dramatic shift, this development of post-supersessionism, the fact that it's making it into dictionaries, scholarly dictionaries. So we should ask, what provoked post-supersessionism? What provoked this development in church theology? So the Gateway Center for Israel, they produce really good content. I recommend their YouTube channel and their website, centerforisrael.com. They wrote a really good article on replacement theology, just entitled Replacement Theology. And to answer this question, they said, after the horrors of the Holocaust, perpetrated by the Nazi state regime in one of the most quote-unquote Christian societies in the world at the time, Christian scholars and thinkers were forced to grapple with the harsh reality that punitive supersessionist thinking, we'll talk more about that, specifically punitive supersessionist thinking, had continued to compel many Christians into an ugly form of anti-Semitism. Adolf Hitler constantly accused the Jewish people of deicide, of murdering God. This theological soul-searching, coupled with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, led to a decline in the classical view of supersessionism. So essentially seeing how replacement theology was used by the Nazis to justify their actions in the Holocaust, and then the establishment of the State of Israel and Jewish people returning to Israel really shook up Christian theologians, and they called into question this long-standing theological tradition of replacement theology because of these things that happened in real life, how theology impacted the world around them, how the world around them impacts their theology. So some characteristics of a post-supersessionist interpretation of the Bible include these things. So first and foremost, as Dr. Solon mentioned, is it excludes supersessionist interpretations of biblical passages and theological features or theological systems. 2, it begins with the assumption that the New Testament is thoroughly Jewish, written by Jews, and thus pro-Jewish. 3, the ecclesia, or the church, or the body of Messiah, is fundamentally an ecclesia of Jews and Gentiles. The principal passage where we see that is Acts 15, where the early community of those who were following Yeshua were entirely Jewish. Gentiles started to come in, and the question was not, can you be Jewish and follow the Messiah? It was, can you be Gentile and follow the Messiah? Or do they need to become circumcised? Do they need to become Jewish to join us, to follow Yeshua, to join our community? The decision there by James, Peter, Paul, all the elders was like, no, Gentiles should stay Gentiles. They should not be circumcised. They should not take on the entire Torah. And therefore, at that moment forward, the ecclesia was understood to be a unity of Jews and Gentiles in the same body of Messiah. And so, kind of flowing from that third point, the 4th, 5th, and 6th include, it is cognizant of Jew-Gentile distinctions in the text of Scripture and the audience of the text of Scripture. So, for example, the Torah is predominantly written to Jewish people. It has its relevance to non-Jews, but it's written to Jewish people. Similarly, the letters of Paul, by and large, are written to non-Jewish people. That doesn't mean there isn't relevance to Jewish people, but it is primarily written to non-Jewish people. So post-supersessionist interpretation takes that into account. It also takes into account the distinction in the first century Yeshua following community, as we discussed, and in ongoing reality today, the distinction between Jews and non-Jews. 5th, it presumes that ongoing distinction between Jews and Gentiles in the ecclesia is a beautiful thing. It's not a scary thing. It's not something to be avoided. The diversity within the unity of the ecclesia shows that the God of Israel is the God of Israel and of the whole world. We'll talk more about that as well. And then 6, Joel Willits, he says, a post-supersessionist approach to the New Testament constructs social space for Jewish ethnic identity within the ecclesia of the Messiah, Yeshua. So again, theology that impacts real life. He's saying that a post-supersessionist approach to the New Testament actually constructs something in real life that enables Jewish followers of Yeshua to live out Jewish lives. And actually in this article, he is referring specifically to Messianic Jewish communities, places where Jewish followers of Yeshua can comfortably live out their Jewish identity within the ecclesia. So places like Messianic Jewish synagogues are real-life manifestations of post-supersessionist theology. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about specific kinds of supersessionism. I think it'll be valuable to talk about different kinds so that we can recognize it, recognize the nuances. And so 2 broad categories of replacement theology. There's more than this, but they kind of all end up sounding somewhat the same, as we'll see. But the first one is punitive replacement theology. Some scholars call it hard replacement theology or maximal replacement theology. The next one we'll talk about is economic supersessionism, or others call it soft supersessionism, or others call it fulfillment theology. And then we will talk about a very unique and very new kind of replacement theology that is very distinct from the others, that is called one law theology. And we'll talk about that later. All right, so first, punitive supersessionism. So punitive, think punishment. That'll be the main characteristic of this. So again, Dr. Solon, he says this. He says, some, for example, Justin Martyr and Tertullian, emphasize the persistent failure and disobedience of the Jewish people, culminating in their crucifixion of Jesus and rejection of the Easter gospel. According to this view, punitive supersessionism, God finally cast off unbelieving Jews because of their sins and gave their inheritance to another people, the Gentile church. So essentially, Jews earned and deserved replacement theology because they were disobedient, and for some, it was because they murdered God, charges of deicide. And so for that, all the promises and blessings that God promised to Israel have now been transferred or given to the Gentile church in this view. Messenger scholar Dr. David Rudolph, he says this about punitive supersessionism. He says, this refers to the idea that God has cursed the Jewish people because they rejected Christ. According to this view, God revoked his covenant with Israel, removed their elect status, terminated their boundary markers of distinction, destroyed Jerusalem, sent Israel into exile, and transferred Israel's blessings to the church. So it gives a little bit more detail as to what that all means when the church replaces Israel as God's chosen people. So an example of punitive supersessionism can be found in Martin Luther. In his tractate on the Jews and their lies, he says, "Listen, Jew, are you aware that Jerusalem and your sovereignty, together with your temple and priesthood, have been destroyed for over 1,460 years? For such ruthless wrath of God is sufficient evidence that they assuredly have erred and gone astray. Therefore, this work of wrath is proof that the Jews, surely rejected by God, are no longer his people, and neither is he any longer their God." So this is a pretty textbook example of punitive supersessionism. Because Israel was disobedient, God was no longer faithful to the promises he gave to Israel and gave them to someone else, the Gentile church. So you can kind of get a sense for the problems that this has for Christians. If God could fail, or if God could neglect or transfer the promises to Israel, then why not at some point could God transfer the promises to the church to someone else? It really calls into question God's faithfulness. And so that was Martin Luther's theological take. But again, we'll see how his theology impacted real life. So later on the Jews and their lies, he gives practical advice to rulers on how to treat Jewish people. And I won't read every word, but essentially he lists many things, but what you'll see on the screen is first, he instructs them to set fire to synagogues and Jewish schools. Second, he instructs them to burn Jewish homes. Third, to take prayer books and Talmudic writings from them. Fourth, to forbid their rabbis from teaching. Fifth, to make it unsafe for Jews to travel on the roads, and other things. In conclusion, he says, "In brief, dear princes and lords, those of you who have Jews under your rule, if my counsel does not please you, find better advice, so that you and we all can be rid of the unbearable, devilish burden of the Jews. Such a desperate, thoroughly evil, poisonous, and devilish lot are these Jews, who for these 1,400 years have been and still are our plague, pestilence, and our misfortune. In my opinion, the problem must be resolved thus. If we wish to wash our hands of the Jews' blasphemy and not share in their guilt, we have to part company with them. They must be driven from our country. So again, theology impacts your life. So much so that portions of this tractate on the Jews and their lives were printed and published by the Nazis and distributed around Germany leading up to and during the Holocaust to justify to the German people what they were doing to the Jewish people. And so Hitler used Luther's theology to justify his murdering of millions of Jewish people. And so this is an example from the Second Council of Nicaea. So last week we talked about the First Council. This is the Second Council. It took place in 787 CE, so about 400 years after the First Council. Not every church, I'm pretty sure only the Roman Catholic Church ever held to this. And now, I don't know if it's still on the books or not. Definitely it is loosened in practice. But this is an example of how replacement theology impacts the treatment of Jewish people who come to faith, at least within the Catholic Church at this time. So it says, since some of those who come from the religion of the Hebrews, Jewish people, mistakenly think to make a mockery of Christ who is God, pretending to become Christians, but denying Christ in private by both secretly continuing to observe the Sabbath and maintaining other Jewish practices, we decree that they shall not be received to communion or at prayer or into the church, but rather let them openly be Hebrews according to their own religion. They should not baptize their children or buy or enter into possession of a slave, but if one of them makes his conversion with a sincere faith in heart and pronounces his confession wholeheartedly, disclosing their practices and objects in the hopes that others may be refuted and corrected, such a person should be welcomed and baptized along with his children, and care should be taken that they abandon Hebrew practices. However, if they are not of this sort, they should certainly not be welcomed. So kind of in summary, essentially what this is saying is that a test of sincerity of faith in Jesus was if a Jewish person was willing to abandon their Jewish identity upon accepting Yeshua as Messiah, or Jesus as Messiah. If you believe in Jesus, you would and you must abandon your Jewish identity and practice, and thus abandon Jewish identity and passing on Jewish identity. So the replacement theology held by the Catholic Church at this time directly resulted in the dissolving of Jewish identity for those Jewish people who chose, voluntarily or involuntarily, to enter the Catholic Church. But luckily, in 1965, so many years later, the Roman Catholic Church held the Second Vatican Council, and part of their conclusions regarding the Roman Catholic Church's relationship to other religious groups, including the Jewish people, says this. It says, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews, without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. All right, so while not everything about this is perfect, what this is a rejection of punitive supersessionism. And so that is really an incredible thing for the Roman Catholic Church to reject such a long-standing theological position that they had. So you can nitpick on some things, but this is a rejection of punitive supersessionism that did so much damage throughout history to the Jewish people. And the reason why we know something like the Second Vatican Council, Canon 8, is really no longer in force, at least in practice, is because now there are visible and outwardly practicing Jewish Catholics and talks and discussions and attempts at creating Jewish space within the Catholic Church. So that what Joel Willis was talking about in post-supersessionist theology, actually constructing social space for Jews within the ecclesia, is at least being attempted to happen within the Roman Catholic Church. And so, say what you want about the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not here to get into really anything about them, other than to say, it has been positive developments in regards to replacement theology within the Roman Catholic Church, and for that we should be very, very appreciative. But so that this counts as a Bible study, we'll look into some scripture. So punitive supersessionism, one of the textbook passages that they would point to is Matthew 27:22 through 25 to justify this claim that the Jews have been cursed by God, therefore the promises of Israel have been sent to the Gentile church instead. So this passage, it's Yeshua's trial before Pilate, and it says, "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, so this is a Jewish crowd, "His blood is on us and on our children." So, what a punitive supersessionist would say when reading this passage, they would interpret it as saying that the Jews killed God, so the charge of deicide, and because of that, God cursed every Jew everywhere for all time. God is no longer in covenant with the Jewish people because they committed this deicide, and now the covenant and the promises and the blessings all go to Christians who follow Christ. But now, with Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church interprets it in a more post-supersessionist way. They say, if we were to go back, that the claim of his blood is on us and on our children applied to only those who cried it out, so a limited number of Jewish people at that time in history. So it's not an expansive curse on the Jewish people. So that is why in Nostra Aetate, what we were reading, they make a point to highlight that it was not all Jewish people everywhere that are charged with putting the Messiah to death. So that's what they're referring to as this punitive supersessionist interpretation of Matthew 27. A whole lot more can be said about that passage and ways to read it in a post-supersessionist way, but that's really what the Roman Catholic Church is doing in brief in Nostra Aetate, where they deny the legitimacy of punitive supersessionism. And so just as a cool kind of symbol of their rejection of punitive supersessionism, they constructed or commissioned a new statue to be built. I meant to put up another picture, but there's these two figures are synagoga and ecclesia, so embodiments of the synagogue and the church. And these are two famous statues that previously, for thousands of years throughout church history, were positioned in a very supersessionist way. The ecclesia, or the woman symbolizing the church, was postured in a triumphal manner, gazing down at synagoga, who had blindfolds and the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, just holding on with their fingertips, about to drop them. So it's a very potent representation of replacement theology. But here, to symbolize their rejection of replacement theology, they had now postured synagoga and ecclesia sitting together, studying together, and learning from one another as equals. And so this was done in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, and it is at St. John's University. So this is just a statement on St. John's University's website about this statue, which is entitled Synagoga and Ecclesia in Our Time. It says, this adversarial contrast was repudiated between the two statues, in 1965 by the Second Vatican Council Declaration, Nostra Aetate, in our time. To mark that document's 50th anniversary, in 2015, St. Joseph's University commissioned a new artwork to reflect Catholic teaching that both communities can learn about God by studying their sacred texts together. And so then, in December 3rd, 2015, an international group of Orthodox rabbis, for the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, of Vatican II, they put out this statement about Nostra Aetate, and it was initially signed by 25 prominent Orthodox leaders, and now has over 60 signees. This document is definitely controversial within the Jewish community and for its own reasons and in its own ways. But it's cool to see that there are Catholics attempting to extend an olive branch to the Jewish community, and some members of the Orthodox Jewish community are reaching out in response. And so they open up talking about Nostra Aetate, how significant it was, and then they express appreciation by saying, "We appreciate the Church's affirmation of Israel's unique place in sacred history and the ultimate world redemption. Today, Jews have experienced sincere love and respect for many Christians that have been expressed in many dialogue initiatives, meetings, and conferences around the world." So I think that is quite cool. And these signatories of this document, which is called "To Do the Will of Our Father in Heaven Toward a Partnership Between Jews and Christians," and it includes Chief Rabbi of Serbia, Chief Rabbi of Croatia, Chief Rabbi of Finland, and there's a bunch of other names, and then also Chief Rabbi of Luxembourg, and Chief Rabbi of Greece, and a lot of scholars and a lot of prominent people in the Jewish community. So that is quite cool, all over the world too. And so then there's another statement put out by the National Jewish Scholars Project at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies. They put this statement out as a full-page advertisement in the New York Times on Sunday, September 10th, in the year 2000. And in this statement, they vocalize appreciation for a Christian acknowledgement that God is still in enduring covenant with the Jewish people, called Davru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity. So we see that there's real progress being made in not only the Catholic Church rejecting punitive supersessionism, but the Jewish community responding in, portions of the Jewish community responding openly in a very positive way in creating dialogue. All right, so that is punitive supersessionism. Now we will talk about economic supersessionism. So instead of it being on the basis of punishment, this is that Israel is replaced by the church because there was always a temporary role for the people of Israel in God's redemptive plan or in God's kingdom. So Michael Vlach, he's a PhD. He's a professor at Theology of Theology at Shepherd's Theological Seminary in Cary, North Carolina. He says this about economic supersessionism: "With economic supersessionism, Israel is not replaced primarily because of its disobedience, but rather because its role in the history of redemption expired with the coming of Jesus. It is now superseded by the arrival of a new spiritual Israel, the Christian church." So essentially, there's planned obsolescence. God, from the beginning of his plan, had this temporary role set for Israel, only in waiting for the church to come onto the scene and have the blessings of Israel and the promises of Israel transferred to them. So it's just all part of God's plan, essentially, is the idea of economic supersessionism. So it avoids the punitive measure, it avoids this vitriolic looking down upon Jewish people in very explicit ways, looking down at Israel in very explicit ways, but it still results in the same thing of this, of the Christian church replacing Israel as God's chosen people and receiving the promises God gave to Israel. And so Dr. Rudolph again on economic supersessionism says, "Here the church replaces the Jewish people as the people of God. However, the reason is not because the Jewish people rejected Jesus, but because it was God's plan from the beginning for Jewish election and Jewish law to expire when God sent the Messiah. Another way of putting it is that with the advent of Christ, Jewish law is fulfilled and obsolete, with the result that God replaces Israel with the church." So the Gateway Center for Israel, they make a very important observation about the role redefinition plays in all these conversations about replacement theology. It says that there are many forms of supersessionism that say Israel has not been replaced, but rather redefined. It is important to recognize that both redefinition and replacement often amount to the same thing. If an entity is redefined, then its old definition is replaced by its new definition. Arguments based on replacement are typically more blatant, whereas arguments based on redefinition are far more subtle. In a certain sense, there are endless variations of supersessionism, with newer forms continually succeeding older forms. So economic supersessionism does go about redefinition. And so an example of this is N.T. Wright. He is maybe the most famous and most impactful Christian theologian on the scene today. He says this in his doctoral dissertation in 1980, but he says many of the same things still today. He says that in Romans 5-8, Paul develops the picture of the church in terms belonging to Israel. This transfer is achieved in two stages. First, Israel's calling, responsibilities, and privileges have been taken over by the Messiah himself alone. Second, what is true of the Messiah is reckoned to be true of his people. In him, all believers, without distinction of race, inherit all that was Israel's. Paul, in line with Old Testament prophecy, claims that God's glory has been taken away from Israel according to the flesh and given to the community of the new covenant. The Christian is the true Jew. He, Paul, transfers the name Israel to the church. So this is very clearly a redefinition of Israel, going from the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the church. And so again, there are practical outworkings of this theological starting point. And so in N.T. Wright's work, and this is all pointed out by Dr. David Rudolph in his article, One New Man, which I'll mention later on. And I consider it required reading for everybody, but especially us in the Messianic Jewish community. But he points out that in N.T. Wright's work, N.T. Wright advocates or concludes that Paul would be, quote, happy to see other Jewish Christians, unquote, eat unkosher food. 2, he says that Shabbat and Jewish festivals are, quote, irrelevant and, quote, a matter of indifference to Paul. And 3, Jewish identity markers, or what he calls Torah badges, such as circumcision, no longer matter. So a lot of the things that make Jewish people and Jewish community recognizable and visible to the world as Jews, N.T. Wright's soft supersessionism either renders them like kind of like neutral, or at best, or at worst, like you shouldn't be doing those things. Paul would be happy to see Jewish Christians eat unkosher food. That's more of the ideal that Paul is striving for. And we see statements saying as much in his book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. There he says, it was vital to Paul to see the Messiah's cross blocking the way to any perpetuation of the world of Torah observance in which he had grown up and been active. Blocking the way to any perpetuation of the world of Torah observance. And then he also says, Paul is saying as strongly as possible that these identity markers no longer matter. So by that I hear Jewish identity no longer matters. And so just to talk about a couple passages that those in favor of economic supersessionism may give. One is Galatians 3:28, which says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Messiah, Jesus. So they really focus on that first line. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. See, ethnic distinction is dissolved within the church, within the ecclesia, within the body of Messiah, because Galatians 3:28 says there's neither Jew nor Gentile. Obviously, the response is to read the rest of the verse, particularly where it says, nor is there male and female. Paul is not saying here that gender has been dissolved once somebody comes to faith in Yeshua, because of course we see Paul talking to men and women all throughout his letters as men and as women. So what's not being said here is that these identities dissolve upon accepting Yeshua, but that Yeshua is available to all people. Every ethnicity, every occupation, every status in society, every gender. Yeshua is available to all through faith. But perhaps the biggest one for them is Galatians 6:15 through 16. These verses say, "For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God." So the Israel of God, this was mentioned earlier on when Dr. Solon was talking about replacement theology, about the church being the new Israel of God. So this is a unique phrase in Paul's letters, Israel of God. This is the only place where it appears in his letters. But the way an economic supersessionist would interpret it is they would say, oh, see, circumcision is meaningless, uncircumcision is meaningless, ethnic identity is meaningless. It's about being a new creation, and once you become a new creation, you enter the Israel of God, which is essentially the church. It's not the Jewish people. And so, how can we interpret this in a post-supersessionist manner? So, quickly, verse 15, where it says, "For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation." A quick way to respond to that is that Paul is not saying that circumcision doesn't matter in every single way. Because for one, all throughout Galatians, Paul is telling the Gentiles in Galatia to not be circumcised very seriously. So I'd rather you castrate yourselves than be circumcised. I don't know about you, but that sounds like circumcision matters. So we know when Paul says this in verse 15, he's not saying in every regard it's irrelevant. But again, he's saying in regards to becoming a new creation, Jews can become a new creation, non-Jews can become a new creation. You don't have to be one or the other. But then verse 16, what do we do with this? So Christian scholar Douglas Moo, he gives 3 translation options for Galatians 6:16, and they're characterized there by the NIV in the first one, ESV second, and then HCSV in the third. The NIV one says, "Peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to the Israel of God." So this sounds like a redefinition of Israel. Circumcision is nothing. It's about being a new creation in Messiah. Everyone who's a new creation in Messiah is a member of the Israel of God. Therefore, Israel has been redefined. The second is a bit more ambiguous. It says, "And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God." All right, are those who walk by this rule the same or a different entity than the Israel of God? It's a little more ambiguous in the ESV there. But then the third one says, this is the Holman Christian Standard Bible, says, "May peace come to all those who follow this standard, and mercy also to the Israel of God." So this seems to more clearly distinguish those who follow this rule on one hand and the Israel of God on the other. And so Gateway Center for Israel, in that same article on replacement theology, they say this regarding Galatians 6:16. Galatians 6:16. So they're referring to the work of Jonathan Pratt. He's a New Testament scholar. He says, "Jonathan Pratt convincingly argues that the Greek syntax and Paul's wider usage of Israel," that's in reference to how every other time Paul uses Israel, it is very clearly in reference to Jewish people. Israel of God in Galatians 6:16 and maybe Romans 9:6 are the only 2 places where it's ambiguous in any way, but it very clearly is not clearly to Gentiles. Throughout his writing, strongly favors understanding the Israel of God as Jewish believers in Jesus and not as a combined entity of Jewish and Gentile believers. The Israel of God is the historic ethnic Israel of God's making and choosing, not the Israel that the Galatian Gentiles supposed they could contrive in their own flesh by being circumcised. Therefore, even in Paul's letters, Israel continues to refer to the genealogical descendants of Jacob, to whom God has promised to remain faithful. So, for our post-supersessionist reading, we looked at the translation options, so we were willing to look back in the Greek. And although there is a supersessionist option to translate, we are inclined to the post-supersessionist option. And we remain cognizant of the ongoing distinction between Jew and non-Jew in Galatians, in the letter, and in the ecclesia. So we knew that there's multiple possibilities to who is being referred to here. We know that the primary audience of Galatians were non-Jews because he's speaking to them to tell them not to be circumcised. If they were Jews, they'd already be circumcised because circumcision happens on the 8th day. So we know he's talking to non-Jews. But because we're cognizant of the ongoing distinction between Jew and non-Jew in the ecclesia, we know that it's possible to read the Israel of God as specifically Jewish followers of Yeshua, in tandem with those who follow this rule in Galatia, non-Jews. And so this unearths a reasonable interpretation of the text that is more consistent with how Paul uses the word Israel throughout the rest of his letters. So he's just using it in the normal way. And so that's more likely than him being innovative in one place, but not innovative in many others. And 5, it is essentially just a better reading and a post-supersessionist reading. All right, so I think it'd be helpful to talk about some smoke signals of hard and soft replacement theology. So these are just common phrases that I've heard now, just because you hear somebody say these phrases doesn't necessarily mean that they hold to replacement theology of any sort, but I do find that those who do hold to replacement theology tend to say these things. So hopefully that distinction is clear. But if you're in conversation and somebody says phrases like these, I would recommend simply asking, what do you mean by that? Before accusing them of replacement theology, because they may just not be aware of what implications their words have. But saying things like Christians are the true Jews, Christians are spiritual Jews, the church is the new Israel, the church is the true Israel, the church is the spiritual Israel, the church inherits the blessings of Israel, there's Israel of the flesh has been replaced by the spiritual Israel of the church, Christians are the true children of Abraham, there are no longer Jews and Greeks, Jesus Christ is the true Israel, God's promises are spiritually fulfilled in the church, God's promises are transferred to the church. Paul converted and became a Christian. Baptism is the true circumcision. Circumcision is nothing in every way. Sunday is the Sabbath. Israel's role was to prepare the way for the church, and the land promises to Israel find their fulfillment in the entire world. So again, just because somebody says that doesn't necessarily mean they hold replacement theology, but I find that people who hold to replacement theology tend to say things like this. All right. So we talked about punitive supersessionism, economic supersessionism, and now we'll talk about one law theology. So this is the belief that all followers of Yeshua are responsible to keep all of the Torah, with an emphasis on the feasts in particular. And this essentially presumes that all believers are Israel or are Jewish, or it acts as if all believers are Israel or are Jewish. And so to talk about this, I'm going to essentially rely on the IAMCS position paper on one law theology. So the IAMCS we are a member of this organization. Bethel is the International Alliance of Messianic Congregations and Synagogues. It's associated with the MJA. And so this is a position paper written by the organization that we are a part of. And it says this about one law theology. It says, one law doctrine is based on the idea that everybody everywhere ought to be keeping the Torah given to the Jews at Sinai. In their view, the law wasn't intended just for Israel, but for everyone. A particular concern to them seemed to be the laws pertaining to Shabbat and festival observances, as well as the dietary laws. So broadly speaking, that is the main characteristic of one law theology, or in other words, Hebrew roots communities is another term that could be applied to them. So the IMCS makes this claim. It says, almost inevitably, one law, one people teaching is associated with the idea that people who keep the Torah given to Israel actually are Israel. The question of Israel identity always seems to be related to this doctrine of one law. Thus, not only is it wrong on its face theologically, but it is deeply and intimately intertwined with replacement theology. And this gets really confusing because many one law and Hebrew roots people even call themselves Messianic, and even at times call themselves Messianic Jews. So this definitely causes a lot of confusion, and hence the need that the IMCS felt to write this position paper. So they go on to say, the idea behind one law theology, whether stated or implied, is that he who keeps the law given to Israel, therefore, is Israel. Accordingly, one law theology is simply a form of replacement theology. By keeping the laws that are specific to Israel, one thereby presumes to be Israel. Dr. David Rudolph, talking about the same issue of one law being replacement theology. He says the reason why it's replacement theology, he says, if all Gentile believers lived like Jews, the Jewish people would no longer be distinct. If the Jewish people were no longer distinct, they would cease to exist as a people set apart from the nations. In this sense, the Hebrew roots one law view is an indirect form of replacement theology. The replacement perspective is also manifest when Hebrew roots / one law adherents identify as Israel, and when they say things like, don't call them Jewish festivals, they are God's festivals. And so the one law community and the Hebrew roots community is very informal, very grassroots. But just to give you guys a list, they're very popular online. That's really where they exercise their influence. So groups like 119 Ministries on YouTube, they're One Law. Lion and Lamb Ministries, they're One Law. Unlearn the Lies with Lex Meyer. David Wilbur, Messiah Matters, the Torah Resource. Torah Life Ministries, Messianic Torah Observant Israel, so they even call themselves Messianic. And then the Worldwide Church of God and the Sacred Name Movement. Those are just a few of them to keep an eye out for. So again, to the IMCS position paper, it says, we in the Messianic Jewish movement also wish to make clear the fact that we are opposed to one law theology, and to any doctrine which advocates, as one law does, the idea that new covenant faith among the Gentiles is to be fulfilled by embracing the Sinai covenant. And it goes on to say more about that. But I highly recommend reading the paper, One Law, Two Sticks. It's found on the IMCS website. So again, some smoke signals. So again, just because you hear somebody say this doesn't necessarily mean they are one law or Hebrew roots, but in my experience, those who say these things those who are one law or Hebrew roots tend to say these things. Things like, believers are Jews because they are circumcised of the heart. Believers are spiritual Jews, so pretty much the same language as replacement theology. Believers are grafted into Israel. They often attempt to pronounce the divine name or pronouncing Yeshua in strange ways, like Yehoshua. They'll say things like the Torah is God's law, therefore it's everybody's law. It's not just the Jewish people's law. Similarly, they are God's feasts, not Israel's feasts. They have a very low view of the church. They'll say the church is pagan. They'll denigrate Gentile identity. They'll say Gentile means pagan. I'm not a Gentile. And they'll say things like we should live like Jesus lived. He lived a Jewish life. Therefore, I should live a Jewish life. They'll quote John, not 1 John, John 14, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And they also tend to wear belt loop tzitzit. So again, just because you see somebody wearing that or saying these things doesn't necessarily mean that they are one law or Hebrew roots, but those who are Hebrew roots and one law tend to say these things or wear those things. So they love John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And they will not pay attention to the distinction between Jew and non-Jew in the ecclesia. And so for them, they're not paying attention to the audience of the Torah, because for them, the Torah is for everyone. So therefore they say, oh, well, I'm going to read the Torah, I'm going to keep all of it, because it's for me. However, not all the Torah applies to everyone, and that's something the Torah itself is very clear about. Some laws are just for the high priest, some laws are just for priests, some laws are just for Levites, some laws are just for men, some laws are just for women, some laws are just for husbands, some laws are just for wives, some laws are just for Jewish people, which was the decision of Acts 15. So essentially the way that we should understand this verse, if it is in regards to the Torah itself, is if you love me, you will keep my commandments that apply to you. Me as a Jewish man, I should not read, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, that therefore I should read the laws for women and try to keep them myself. In the same way, that same distinction can be had for Jews and non-Jews. But one law is even worse. So Dr. Rudolph points out, the Hebrew roots one law view leads to the erasure of Gentile identity in the body of Messiah, since everyone is called to live like a Jew. This means that all churches should ideally become Hebrew roots communities. The replacement theology view moves in the opposite direction. Instead of erasing Gentile identity, it erases Jewish identity within the ecclesia. So I spent a lot of time making a very beautiful graphic. So this is the ecclesia of Jews and Gentiles in its ideal form, where it is noticeably Jews and Gentiles. And it is a practical manifestation of what we read in Romans. Romans 3:29 through 31 says, or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. For I tell you, the Messiah became a servant to the circumcised, to the Jewish people, to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. As it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. And again it is said, rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. So Gentiles with Israel, worshiping God through the Messiah together. So this graphic shows what Romans 3 and Romans 15 are describing. That the ecclesia of Jews and Gentiles is visibly and noticeably Jews and Gentiles worshiping God through Messiah Yeshua, through faith in Messiah Yeshua, together. However, the outcome of hard or soft supersessionism does not look like this. It looks like this. It looks like God is the God of Gentiles only. Only Gentiles are worshiping along other Gentiles. It does not look like it should, the ecclesia of Jews and Gentiles, where visibly we see Jews and Gentiles. But then what of the outcome of one law theology? It looks like this. God is the God of Jews only, or so it seems. God is not the God of Gentiles also. But what's worse about this is you not only cannot tell who the Jews are, you also can't tell who the Gentiles are. So not only is Jewish identity erased, but Gentile identity is also erased. So again, theology has practical ramifications. It impacts what communities look like, and it impacts how people live their lives. And the outcome of one law theology is not a reflection of Romans 3, Romans 15, and the outcome of replacement theology also is not accurate to Romans 3 or Romans 15. So supersessionism in summary by the Gateway Center for Israel says, in summary, supersessionism is therefore more than just the belief that the church has replaced Israel or that Israel has been redefined to include all Christians. Any theology that results in the elimination of the ongoing distinction between Jew and Gentile is ultimately supersessionist. And that's why we have to look to see what's happening in real life as an outcome of theologies. But to end on a more positive note, I just want to share very quickly some examples of Christian theologians working towards constructing post-supersessionist theology in their respective denominations. So the first one is Dr. Matthew Tape. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he is a Roman Catholic. He wrote the book Aquinas on Israel and the Church, The Question of Supersessionism and the Theology of Thomas Aquinas, who's probably the most important Roman Catholic theologian of all time, by my understanding. And then The God of Israel and Christian Theology by Dr. Kendall Solon. He's a Methodist. And this book really is fundamental to post-supersessionist theology. In a lot of ways, this really started post-supersessionist theology in a very mainstream kind of way. And then Dr. Gerald McDermott, he's Anglican. He wrote the book Israel Matters, Why Christians Must Think Differently About the People and the Land. And then there's a whole series on the entire New Testament by Christian and Messianic Jewish scholars, published by Cascade. This is an example of a book on Romans, reading Romans after supersessionism, the continuation of Jewish covenantal identity by Dr. J. Brian Tucker. He's a professor at Moody Theological Seminary in Detroit. And there is also an academic society called the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. This is from the front page of their website. It says, the society seeks to overcome understandings of the New Covenant that entail the abrogation or obsolescence of God's covenant with the Jewish people, of the Torah as a demarcator of Jewish communal identity, or of the Jewish people themselves. And so they have many scholars and religious community leaders sign on to be part of this society. And they have meetings at an annual biblical studies conference that I've attended each of the last 5 years, I think. And the panel that they do each year actually happens the day before the big conference starts, so not everybody is there. But despite not everybody being there, the room is always packed out with 100 plus scholars and theologians, and lively discussion is always had. And the society includes Catholics, it includes Greek Orthodox, Protestants of all kinds, and Messianic Jews. And so all teamed up together in pursuing to correct replacement theology. So that is really cool. And then another organization to be aware of is Toward Jerusalem Council 2. So that's in reference to Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. But the goal of Toward Jerusalem Council 2 is to connect with churches all over the world to sign these affirmations that essentially amount to post-supersessionist theology. And so I'll just read this last one, number 6. So one of the affirmations it's getting churches to sign on and to commit to is, we affirm our willingness to be a voice within our own ecclesiastical structures and spheres of influence against all forms of anti-Semitism, replacement theology, and teaching that precludes the expressions of Jewish identity in Jesus. So this is another really cool project that's happening out there. So all that to say, there's still work for the church to do and for us to help them. Joel Willits, he says, most denominations in the last half century have thoroughly denounced the supersessionism that has shaped the interpretation of every aspect of the New Testament since as early as the 2nd century, except for the occasionally rare sectarian movement. It must still be admitted that this reappraisal of the New Testament's relationship to Judaism has yet neither been fully worked out with the New Testament scholarship, nor has it made much of a dent in the preaching and teaching ministry and the liturgy of the local parish. So even though denominations like the Roman Catholic Church are putting out things like Nostra Aetate, and numerous Protestant denominations putting out very serious statements denouncing replacement theology, it's in one way you could say that it hasn't quite reached the pews yet. So you still commonly hear replacement theology taught from the pulpit, and kind of your common Christian holding to replacement theology, knowingly or unknowingly. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But the really hard part of getting denominations to formally denounce it and seek other solutions has been done. So now it's really for them to teach their people and for their people to have conversations with people like us to be able to share with them. All right, so before parting ways here, when it comes to answering one law theology, and also replacement theology for this first article. Dr. David Rudolph, One New Man, Hebrew Roots Replacement Theology, How to Restore the Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith Without Getting Weird. You can find that on Google if you put it in. Highly recommended. Then the IMCS position paper, One Law, Two Sticks, a critical look at Hebrew Roots movement. And then Jonathan and Mai's channel, Two Messianic Jews, we have some videos addressing one law ideas. The first one is What is a Messianic Gentile, where I distinguish the Messianic Gentile from the one law person. People have found that video very helpful. Should Christians celebrate Sukkot? Is Christmas pagan? And a case for Messianic Judaism. So those are some good ones to turn to. So those have been my 3 classes. And again, it's all to make the broad point that while the church is imperfect and has made tragic mistakes, we should appreciate the church for upholding the Tanakh and whole New Testament as scripture, for defending the deity of Yeshua for millennia, and for working on correcting replacement theology. Thank you, everybody.